everybody, and welcome to another 80s golden age of comedy. I'm your host, Bruce Starr, and I am having just the best time looking back, running into old comedians. Last night, I saw four guys that just blew me away. If people think that comedy's on hold, that comedians are on hold, they're wrong. Comedy is back. It will be back bigger than ever. And the people I saw who were terrific talents in the 80s, boy, they were out last night, and I'm glad I went down to have a chance to see them. Bruce Smirnoff has been a friend of mine since 40 years ago, 1981. And I got a chance to see him and a few of the other fellas, Rich Minervini. I got a chance to see Jimmy Schubert and great people, fantastic people. And I'm really glad that I had a chance to step out last night and see them. But this show is about comedy. Now, of course, the 80s were a golden age. Is it a was or a were, Steve? The 80s were?
Yes.
Okay. The 80s were an incredible time. And I'm just so glad that I happened to be there at the very, very beginning of it and had the experience of my life. And what I also love experiencing and documenting, because there's fewer and fewer talents still around, is what happened before the 80s. Who's the talent that the 80s looked up to and sort of did their act kind of like they did? I'm talking about people that loved Jerry Lewis and Dean Martin, people that loved the Three Stooges, people that loved Abbott and Costello and Stan Laurel and Oliver Hardy. I mean, these were people, and these are people that are brought up on my show all the time. And another great, great family were the Marx Brothers. And if that excites you a little bit to think that we're going to talk about the Marx Brothers, you're going to be in for a great show. I am so excited to bring to you a gentleman who worked closely, was his right-hand man to Groucho Marx. Unbelievable. When I heard that there was someone like that could tell us, share history and share and document what went on in that part of the world at that time, I couldn't wait to hear how I was going to get Steve Stoliar onto the show. So, Steve, welcome to the 80s golden age of comedy. I'm really glad to have you on the show.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here too. I know that that this won't be going out live, but we should say for the record that we are recording this on what would have been Zeppo Marx's 120th birthday.
Wow.
If he were alive today, he'd be dead.
Yes, I think so. So, Steve, how does someone work with an incredible talent? Was it a stumble? Was it an introduction? How does someone get to work with Groucho Marx?
A valid question for which there is no quick answer. I happen to have become a really rabid Marx Brothers fanatic probably around high school, and tried to see whatever movies I could. This is for your younger viewers, long before TCM and streaming video and DVDs, Turner Classic, and even before VHS. I would get the TV guide each week. Our family would get it, and I would go through it with a pencil and circle the movies I wanted to see, which invariably were on at, like, they'd start at 2:38 a.m. And I would just will myself to stay awake past Johnny Carson, past Tom Snyder's Tomorrow Show, into that netherworld of local car commercials, And that's where I would catch up on a lot of classic movies, including the Marx Brothers Paramount films, which were syndicated through MCA Universal. It used to bother me. I mentioned to you that I was a stickler for grammar. It was always a treat and a frustration when I would see that big triangular shield that would say MCA TV release. And I wanted to take white out and make an N. It's not MCA, but I knew that I was in for either a vintage Paramount film or a vintage Universal film, like their classic horror films. And that's how I would catch up on it. And it's hard to describe why I was more drawn to the Marx Brothers than other comedians, although I loved most of them. It isn't like, no, I like the Marx Brothers, but I hated the Three Stooges. You know, it wasn't like that. And of the Marx Brothers, Groucho was immediately the one I related to the most. I think part of it was because their comedy was such a seamless blend of physical comedy and really clever jokes, funny dialogue. When you had people along the lines of George S. Kaufman and S.J. Perelman writing material for them, but then you also had them wallpapering Esther Muir over a couch, you know. So you had broad physical comedy and all of Harpo's pantomime. And then you had Groucho's wonderful lines that, and also he was sort of the fellow who could say the things you wished you could say without getting sent to the principal. Although I must say, I don't have to, but I'm going to. In 11th grade, I had a wonderful teacher named Miss Harper for history. And she liked my sense of humor. She also was great because she told us the personal aspects of historical figures instead of just making us learn 1776 and Alexander Hamilton. So when she was telling us about Ben Franklin, she threw in the fact that throughout his life, he fathered 13 illegitimate children.
Jeez.
And that when he was 80, he had a 16-year-old mistress.
Oh my God.
At which point I piped in, well, he did invent the lightning rod. Now, at any point in time, that isn't a bad line, but when you're 16 and in the compressed atmosphere of a schoolroom, but she cracked up at that, so I wasn't sent to the principal. But Groucho was able to do that sort of thing wherever and whenever. And as a matter of fact, in real life, if people weren't insulted by him, they felt let down. If, Groucho was at a restaurant and called the waiter over and said, you know, the soup tastes like dishwater, the waiter would go, oh, wait till I tell him Groucho insulted. And if Groucho said, you know, this is probably the finest sandwich I've had, it's like, but then after that, oh, that's all. So I was crazy about the Marx Brothers, crazy about Groucho. And I thought, man, I would give anything to cross paths with him just to shake his hand and thank him for all the laughs. But I knew he was in his early 80s, and the chances of that were slim to none. I was fortunate enough to get a ticket to see his one-man show at the Dorothy Chandler Pavilion in December of 1972. The ticket was $9.50, which was a lot of money, which would not pay for your parking there now. But it was a real mixed bag because I was able to be in the same room as my hero, even though it was a huge room. And I clapped so hard because, if you've ever been a rabid fan of someone, my thinking was, I want vibrations from my applause to reach his eardrums because that's the only personal connection I'll ever have. The sad part was he had gotten old and frail, and I was kind of resentful of the press for perpetuating the idea that good old Groucho at 80, 82, just as funny as ever, just as fast as ever. So I was expecting to see basically like a slightly older version of the You Bet Your Life host. And instead, this old man shuffled out and went up to the podium had a slightly slurred speech from a stroke and was reading off of index cards, but it was still Groucho, and it was just electrifying. And then afterwards, my friend and I were in the parking garage, and I spotted Zeppo Marx. I recognized him because my obsession with the Marx Brothers caused me to read whatever books, magazine articles, newspaper articles, and I sort of knew what Zeppo looked like, and I thought that that was him. And I thought, well, I'm never going to meet Groucho, and Harpo and Chico are gone, but damn it, I'm going to meet a Marx brother tonight. So he was with a very young blonde, and he seemed to have trouble finding his car. And I just said, Mr. Marx, excuse me, I just wanted to let you know how much I enjoyed you in your film. And he said, you weren't enjoying me, you were enjoying my brothers. And I thought, gee, I'm so glad I made a point of coming over here to compliment him so that he could snap at me and tell me I was wrong. But the point was I had met a Marx brother. A couple of years later, I was a college student at UCLA studying history, but with a passion for classic films. And I got it into my head that animal crackers, which had been tied up in a legal snag for decades, so it hadn't been on TV and hadn't been reissued in years. It wasn't part of MCATV's package of syndicated old movies. Basically, because of a clerical error, the copyright had expired when it was at Paramount and was never renewed. So Universal got the pre-1949 Paramount films, including Animal Crackers. But in order for them to put it out again or release it on TV, they would have to shell money out. And they thought that that was a ridiculous idea to spend good money on an old black and white movie when they could be spending it on important films like Airport 75. So all my friends and I were Marx fanatics, and we knew that Animal Crackers was the great missing link in their canon of film. They only made about a dozen movies. They weren't like Laurel and Hardy or the Three Stooges cranking out short films a bunch a year for decades and feature films. You know, they were big comedy stars on Broadway in the 20s, and then they made about a dozen movies and then broke up. So the fact that Animal Crackers was their second film based on their stage success, Groucho was Captain Spaulding, so his theme song, Hooray for Captain Spaulding, came from that, and I Shot an Elephant in My Pajamas came from that, and it just deserved to be out. And I managed to get in touch with Erin Fleming, who was the controversial, ambitious young actress who had started out as Groucho's secretary, and she basically became his manager. And as he grew older and hazier, he became more dependent on her. So she really was in charge of Groucho at that time. And she wanted to bring me with her to Universal, to Sid Sheinberg, the president of the company, as basically exhibit A of someone who is obsessed and wants to see this movie out.
Wow.
Which flattered me, but I thought, you know, how is one guy going to convince a corporation? But then between that phone call and going back to school, some friends and I decided to start a petition drive to multiply our striking power and show Universal that it wasn't just some weird kid nerd. It was a whole bunch of kid nerds that wanted to see this classic. So I started the committee for the re-release of Animal Crackers, and we had a table on Bruin Walk next to all the other activist tables as kids walked to class past gay rights and Hare Krishna and legalized marijuana and end the war. And then there's these people trying to get an old Marx Brothers movie out. And it was during the Watergate scandal, and people were so paranoid, they'd pick up the clipboard to sign it and say, do we have to use our legal name? Is this going to be sent to the FBI? Do we have to be registered voters? And it's like, no, we just want to show that there's an audience for this. So Erin Fleming arranged for Groucho to come to UCLA, and we would talk to the press about our campaign. And so astonishingly, I was able to meet my hero. I said, Groucho, I'm very happy to be meeting you after all this time. And he said, well, you should be. And Aaron said, this is Steve Stoliar. He's the one who's trying to get Animal Crackers re-released. And he said to me, well, did you get it? And I said, not yet, but we're working on it. And he said, you better or I'll fire you. I said, I didn't realize I was working for you. How much are you paying me? And he said, a little less than nothing. And I, you know, I was black and blue from pinching myself that any of this was happening. We sat side by side, being peppered with questions from the press, people there with news cameras and microphones, and hundreds of young students crushing in on us to hear his kind of whispery voice. And it was this marvelous blend of Groucho. I was actually, you know, people said, was it disheartening to see the condition he was in? And I said, no, it was like reheartening to see how much of him was still there under those circumstances, not just like he was at the Dorothy Chandler Pavilion. And I remember one reporter said, Mr. Marx, what is the purpose of your appearance here today? And he said, I expect to get lunch. And she said, but no, besides that, I may get dinner. And someone else said, what do you think of how the younger generation has fallen in love with the Marx Brothers? And he said, well, I'm flattered. Last Halloween, 3 kids came to my door dressed as Hoppo, Groucho, and Chico. And I said, what did you give them? And he said, I sent for the police.
You sent them what?
I sent for the police. So, and anyway, it was just my heart was pounding out of my chest. Realize I'm sitting there and we're talking to the press. So that caused a certain amount of embarrassment for Universal, and we got hundreds of signatures, and they relented and said, we will clear the rights and strike fresh prints. We'll run it in Westwood and in New York, and that's it, and we don't want to hear about it anymore. So we had a re-premiere at the UA Westwood. I rented a tuxedo and went with my family, and it was a marvelous, gratifying thing, seeing it on the big screen, a clean print of it. And it ended up breaking the house record at the UA Westwood that had been set by the French Connection several years earlier. And it was super gratifying for me to sit with my roommate in a coffee shop in Westwood and see this line of kids in blue jeans and tennis shoes going down side the brick wall that was lining the UA Westwood. And that summer, I had 2 or 3 summer jobs that fell through, for which I remain eternally grateful. And my dad was saying, I don't want you sitting on your fanny all summer. Go see if Taco Bell needs, and I thought, I don't want to work at Taco Bell. So with my back against the wall, I thought, I have nothing to lose. So I called Aaron Fleming and I said, is there anything at all that you think maybe I might? And she said, well, actually, we need someone to handle Groucho's fan mail, which has gotten to be quite unwieldy in recent times. I used to be his secretary, but now I'm his manager. And also, we need someone who really knows their Marx Brothers to organize all of his memorabilia to be donated to the Smithsonian. And I'm thinking, please, 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 please. And in my mind's eye, it's like a Tex Avery cartoon where I'm instantly on the front doorstep of Groucho's house while she's still describing the job to me. It wasn't quite like that. I actually thought I would probably be working in an office building and, you know, whatever business office they had. And maybe once a month, Groucho would come in to sign checks or something. She said, oh, no, dear, you'll be working right in Groucho's house. There's a room you can use for your office. You can make your own hours and come and go as you please.
Wow.
And they were going to pay me money to do this.
Wow.
So the next thing I knew, I was working every day at Groucho's house I mean, walking through the door the first day was like when Dorothy opens into Munchkinland and it goes from sepia to Technicolor. And there were his memorabilia. There was a painting of the four Marx Brothers by John Decker on the entry wall. All of these souvenirs, letters, and photos of the brothers out of makeup, and then there was my hero in comfortable circumstances, and I got to. There was no. It was a very democratic household. There was no sense that the help ate in the kitchen, so I was always welcome at the lunch table, regardless of who was coming over, and that was a staggering list of people because you never knew who it was going to be. Or if no one came over, gee, I was stuck with my hero and maybe Aaron or a nurse or something. So I got to ask him all these things that I'd wondered about. And also because I was such a history buff, I appreciated him from like three different levels. One was he was Groucho Marx, the guy that insulted Margaret Dumont and flirted with Thelma Todd and wore a grease paint mustache and hosted You Bet Your Life. Second of all, he was someone who was personal friends with people who seemed so mythic to me that hard to believe they existed in three dimensions and in color, like George Gershwin and W.C. Fields and Irving Thalberg and George Kaufman and James Thurber. And, you know, he knew them. And then the third level was he was a man from 1890, a literal Victorian whose firsthand memories went from before the Wright brothers' flight to after the moon landing, which is just a staggering chunk of history. I said, how far back do you remember? And he thought a minute and he said, I guess the Spanish-American War, which was 1898.
Wow.
Also, the Marx Brothers started out as singers before they started putting comedy in the act.
Oh my God.
And he, as a solo singer, when he was 15, sang at the Metropolitan Opera House on a bill that included Enrico Caruso, and the proceeds were going to benefit the victims of the 1906 San Francisco earthquake.
Wow.
So this is the man I'm having grapefruit with. And it just was an amazing ride, you know, handling autograph requests or letters he would dictate and sorting through scrapbooks that his wives had kept from vaudeville through Broadway and radio, letters, scripts with his own annotations on how to improve the lines when they take them on the road. And as I say, I was being paid money for this. So he was, in fact, you know, a reduced version of Groucho because he was in his mid-80s and had stroke. But the mechanism was there. That reflex was so strong that even after it had rusted over, it still. He used to love to get the Hollywood trade papers. Even though he was semi-retired, he liked to keep up with what was happening. So he would get Daily Variety and Hollywood Reporter. And then he would come to the lunch table and basically review the mail I brought him. And one day he said, wonderful mail today, nothing but requests for money. And I said, but you got a variety, didn't you? And he said, yes, a variety of requests for money. Which, you know, he phrased that exactly as if it had been 1928.
I know you've written the book, and I see it behind you.
All right. This is a book I wrote called Raised Eyebrows, My Years Inside Groucho's House. Introduction by Dick Cavett, who became a friend of mine through Groucho. And the blurbs on the back, to toot my own horn, which would mortify my dad, but too bad. Woody Allen said it's one of the best books about a show business icon he's ever read.
Wow.
Dick Cavett said it's a real page turner that is by turns startling, shocking, and as engrossing as a good novel. And Jack Lemmon and Steve Allen also had some very nice things to say about it.
Wow.
And
so I know that people are going to buy your book And
Just the one copy?
well, they have friends,
Oh,
you know.
more than I can say for myself.
But what I'd like you to do is
Yes,
I would
sir.
love for you to pique their interest. And if you could share some of those stories about what happened when people came over and what they talked about, I would love to hear about that.
Well, one day in 1974, George Burns was going to be coming over. And this was actually right before the Sunshine Boys. At the time, his best friend, Jack Benny, was in rehearsals with Walter Matthau to play that part. And it was only because Benny came down with terminal pancreatic cancer
Ah,
that the part went to his best friend, which led to an Oscar and a whole rebirth of George Burns' career. But me being a comedy nerd, I knew full well who George Burns was, and Burns and Allen, and. So I was a little nervous about it. But the doorbell rang and I opened it up, and there's this short, smiling man.
ah.
And he said, you want to live a long time? Become an actor. You'll live to be an old man like Groucho and me. Okay, let's eat. And off we went into the dining room, and I'm sitting there, and he and Groucho, and it would have reminded me of a scene out of the Sunshine Boys, except the film didn't exist yet. They would argue about whether something happened at B.F. Keith's theater in Chicago or the Schubert in Minneapolis. Don't you remember? Because there was the candy store and Hoppo wanted the black jelly beans and we had to sit. No, it wasn't there. That was in Duluth because the one in Minneapolis had the daughter of the theater owner that Chico was screwing. So then afterwards, oh, by the way, Groucho had given up cigars because of his health, for which I was grateful because I think cigars smell horrible, even though that was his trademark. But his friends, many of his friends, still smoked cigars, so there was frequently that aroma. So after lunch, Burns took out a cigar and a plastic holder. So he started fitting it in, and he said to me, I never smoke expensive cigars. All I care about is if it fits the holder. Now, Milton Berle pays $2 a piece for his cigars. If I paid that much for it, I'd go to bed with it before I smoked it. And then he lit up, and so that was ultra cool. On Groucho's 85th birthday, there were a number of notables there to begin with, including Zeppo and Gummo, the other two remaining Marx brothers. Bob Hope stopped by. He was in a tuxedo, but he was in a tuxedo because he was on his way to a testimonial dinner for Danny Thomas and thought he would stop in to pay his respects to Groucho at 85. And Groucho said, this is a man who has made me laugh. And Hope said, gee, Groucho, you don't have to say that. And Groucho said, if you weren't here, I wouldn't say it. And Hope said, it's been going on like this for 40 years. And then I thought he would share reminiscences about Groucho, but instead he started testing his Danny Thomas material on us. And I thought, he said, yeah, that Danny Thomas, he's so religious. He has stained glass bifocals, you know? And I thought, this is, here he is in Groucho Marx's house. But anyway, it didn't matter. It was very cool. Mae West came up and saw Groucho once. That was remarkable.
Wow.
Aaron Fleming Groucho wasn't thrown or nervous being around celebrities because he was one himself. And in fact, historically, he preferred the company of writers. Even at MGM, it didn't matter to him to sit with Clark Gable or Greta Garbo or Joan Crawford to have lunch in the commissary. He wanted to sit at the writer's table where you had stimulating conversation and clever dialogue and political talk and gossip and that sort of thing. But Mae West was coming up and Aaron was nervous. And she said something that you should never say to Groucho, just as you would never say it to a mischievous child. She said, don't say anything that could embarrass us. Well, two of the things, for which Mae West was known. One was that when she and W.C. Fields were making My Little Chickadee, they hated each other. I think that their egos were just too big for the same set. And so they didn't speak to each other except the dialogue. And if they had something to say, they would give a note to an intermediary. So Bill Fields, as they call him, and Mae West didn't get along. The second thing was that in the 20s, she was in a play in New York called Sex, and which was raided by the police, and she was sent to jail for indecency.
Wow.
So the doorbell rings, and Mae West comes in with her muscle-bound assistant. First thing Groucho says is, "Hiya, Mae, what do you hear from Bill Fields?" She says, "In your dreams, Groucho, in your dreams." And then she settled in and they were talking. And then he said, "Say, didn't I throw you in the pokey once?" And Aaron is dying, but Mae West, she says, "Oh, that's true, Groucho, but I always manage to wiggle out of tight situations like that." And I thought, this is mind-blowing. It's the king and queen of Paramount comedy in the same room. And they tried to coax her into singing, and she complained that she didn't have her backup tapes. But Harpo's son, Bill, was there. She said, "If you like, I can do some reciting." So Bill Marx, Harpo's son, started playing a honky-tonk version of Frankie and Johnny. And Mae West steadies herself at the piano with her hand on her hip and starts to deliver this bawdy poem she had written called Pleasure Man from the 20s, while Bill is playing ding, 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 ding. And I thought, I can't believe I'm here. And later that night, she signed a copy of her memoir, Goodness Had Nothing to Do with It. And she wrote, "To Steve, sin-Searly." She always made a point of separating the sin from the Searly. So it was just, but I mean, Jack Lemmon and Milton Berle and Steve Allen was a freak.
I heard that Mae West pretty much stayed in character like the whole time. That's who she was. Is that true?
Yeah, there was no separation. She was very tiny. She was 4'11" in her bare feet.
Wow.
Now you shrink a little bit when you get older, but not that much. So it's a testament to her screen presence that we felt she was this towering, imperious woman.
Oof.
Also, she never went out during the day, so her skin was completely pale.
Wow. With
mascara and then this big coiffure of questionable hair that she insisted was hers. I don't know. And I got to meet S.J. Perelman, who, in addition to co-writing Monkey Business and Duck Soup, was one of the most celebrated humorists of the 20th century, who wrote for The New Yorker for years and won an Oscar for co-writing Around the World in 80 Days.
Wow.
And that stood out. Zeppo and I dated the same girl.
What?
A far cry from the snub I got at the Dorothy Chandler garage in '72. I was dating a very attractive, very bright young lady named Linda, also a student at UCLA. And Zeppo was going to be coming up from Palm Springs to have dinner. And Aaron said, "Why don't you stay for dinner?" And I said, "I'd like to, but I had the date." And she said, "Bring her." And I thought, oh, this is good. Because Linda was fairly unflappable. And I thought, this will flap her. So I picked her up and she said, "Where are we going?" And I said, "It's a surprise." And then I drive down Sunset and I turn left on Hillcrest. And she said, "What is this place?" And I said, "Oh, it's a little out of the way place." And she said, "I know where you're taking me and I don't want to go there." And I said, "Well, we're going." And it was fine. She actually she really enjoyed the atmosphere. And Zeppo was just quite taken with her. He had recently gotten divorced from Barbara because she threw him over for Frank Sinatra. And Zeppo had basically picked up where Chico left off. It is Chico, by the way, because he chased chicks and frequently caught them. He was quite the ladies' man all throughout his life. And so he was kind of enchanted with her. He said, you know, Steve, you and Linda should come visit me in Palm Springs sometime. I'd love to have you. And I said, I don't know. I was there when I was a kid and it was sweltering. And he said, well, when were you there? In the summer? And I said, yeah. And he said, well, Steve, you know, it's cold in Alaska during the winter too. So after she and I broke up, I had a couple of photos of Groucho and Zeppo that I wanted him to sign because they were the only brothers in the picture, and it would be cool to have them both sign it because people wouldn't say it's too bad Chico and Harpo didn't sign it. So I sent them to him in Palm Springs with a cover letter saying, I know you've been around the block a few times. Do you have any advice for the lovelorn? Because Linda and I broke up. 2 days later, my phone rings. Steve, is Zeppo Marx. Is this a bad time? No. Look, I don't want to step on your toes. By the way, I got the pictures and I'll be happy to sign those. God, I was good looking back then. Anyway, do you think that Linda would go out with me? And if this is at all uncomfortable for you, Steve, tell me, because the last thing I would want is, no, it's, she enjoyed meeting you, because I wouldn't want to step on your toes here, Steve. No, let me ask her. And
people were so considerate back then, weren't they?
Yes. May I hit on your ex-girlfriend? So I called her and she was sort of puzzled and amused and intrigued. And so she thought, you know, what the hell? So he took her to dinner in San Diego and then to attend a Hialeah game in Tijuana. I guess that was Zeppo's standard first date. Dinner in San Diego, Hialeah game. And I talked to him afterwards and he said, Steve, I want you to know I never even kissed her. She was very nice, but really all she did was talk about herself. And then I saw her on campus and she said, Zeppo was really nice, but all he really did was talk about himself. And I thought, gee, there's a certain symmetry there.
Wow.
And then afterwards, if I was at a party at Groucho's and Zeppo was there, he would make a point of bringing someone over and saying, this is Steve. He's a nice fella. He and I dated the same girl, but he got further with her than I. So yeah, she was 19, I was 20, and he was 74. And as I mentioned, would be 120 as of this second. So
let me ask you.
Yes, sir.
Only you would know this, really. Maybe of people alive. What could you tell me about each of the brothers that people really don't know? People wouldn't have any idea. That's been lost in space, lost in history.
Well, that people don't know. Harpo, it is virtually impossible to find anyone to say a bad word about Harpo. He was as angelic as the instrument he played. There's certain celebrities, people like Danny Kaye, who entertained millions of kids and was beloved and be hated by everyone that worked with him. You never hear anyone say, let me tell you what a shit Harpo was. Just, he adopted several children when he got married in 36. He said he wanted to have a child in each window of the house waving to him when he left for work each morning. Just a charming, I'm so sorry I never got to meet him. Chico, in addition to being a womanizer, was a compulsive gambler, which makes for great stories. But if anyone has had anyone with an addictive personality in their family, the other brothers were always bailing him out. He would throw away good cards in a poker hand to make it more exciting if he was on the verge of winning. He owed a guy money and he wrote him a check and he said, cash this Monday at noon. And the guy saw him that week. He said, that check you gave me bounced. And Chico said, when did you cash it? He said, I guess about 12:30. And Chico said, I told you to cash it at noon. He would bet a passenger in a taxi cab $100 which of two raindrops would reach the bottom of the window first. Just the excitement. It's like, where's the game? What's the bet? Where's the horse? You know. Gummo had a sense of humor. You never hear about him because he left the act in 1918 to go fight World War I. Spoiler alert, we won. He didn't see any fighting. It was late. It was 1918 and it was on the verge of ending. But that was why he left, to go be a doughboy. And so Zeppo became the straight man at the age of 17, was never really comfortable being a performer. And Zeppo had a great sense of humor and really lit up the room when he came in. And you hear people say he was the funniest brother off stage and think, oh, well, that's ridiculous because he was just, but really by the time he came along, the other three, their characters were so well developed that there just wasn't anything left for him to do except announce Groucho or play the male lead or something.
And Harpo, for people that don't know, Harpo played a little bicycle horn?
Yeah, he had a horn. He didn't speak. He could, but didn't. And I think he had difficulty remembering lines when they were in vaudeville. The others, Groucho and Chico, were able to remember their lines. Harpo had trouble, so they gave him fewer and fewer, and he had developed more physical business and then the harp solo until they finally thought, why should we put ourselves through this? You'll be silent, and this sort of imp that gets into mischief, and let us do Chico would have his malaprops with broken Italian, and Groucho would have his double entendre. So that's what happened with Harpo. I met Gummo, and it didn't have anything interesting for him to sign, so I just took an index card and asked if he'd autograph it to me. So he signed it, and as he handed it to me, he said, you know, if this were at the bottom of a check, it might actually be worth something. So he had a sense of humor as well. Groucho had a serious side. I mean, he was called Groucho because of his personality. And I learned that when they were kids, his mother's nickname for him was Der Dunkel, which means the dark one.
Wow.
Because he was moody. Wow. Compared to the others. So the Groucho sprang naturally from his own personality.
From being a grouch, obviously. People would call him Grouch, and that went to Groucho.
Yeah, I mean, he was divorced 3 times. Each of his wives would become disenchanted with him. Although you'd wonder, what did they think they were getting in for? But his wives were markedly younger than he was, and they wanted to do frilly, fun social things, and he wanted to sit around smoking cigars and talking about politics with his friends, and they would get bored and they would start to drink. And Groucho, I remember someone coming over to interview him for his 85th birthday, and he said, I was married 3 times. I married all my wives for their looks. None of them had anything upstairs except another man from time to time. So, and it's true, and it's too bad because Harpo was very happily married to a very lovely woman. Groucho knew men who had attractive but also equally stimulating mentally, but that didn't interest him. You know, Mr. 1890 thought, you know, I want a young woman to bear me children and do wifely things. And,
how many kids did he have altogether?
He had 2. He had a son, Arthur, and a daughter, Miriam, by his first wife, and they were born in the 20s, and they're both gone now. And then his middle wife, Kay, and he had a daughter, Melinda, and he would bring her out once a season on You Bet Your Life to do a little song and dance. And she was interested for a little while. in being a singer. In 65, she made a record called The East Side of Town, which basically sounds like Petula Clark's Downtown played sideways. It was clearly meant to emulate what was then the hit song. And so she basically turned her back on show business, and now she lives in Northern California playing the mandolin. And she's actually now a grandparent, which blows what's left of my mind. So yeah, he had the 3 children, and it was just a remarkable experience for me, and I never took any of it for granted.
Good.
The other thing that was cool, I don't know if you've had the experience of meeting someone when you're younger and you can't fully appreciate them, and then when you're older you go, oh man, that's who that was. I wished I'd asked them about. But because the job coincided with the pinnacle of my obsession with the Marx Brothers, I knew who all of these people were. Someone would come into lunch, Nat Perrin, and my mind would flip to the Rolodex card, Nat Perrin. He worked on Monkey Business and Duck Soup. He's in the Groucho letters. His nickname was the Deacon. He created the Addams Family. He's one of Groucho's oldest friends. And then they appreciated the fact that I wasn't just some, hippie teen, pot smoking rock and roll guy, but I cared about. And that meant a lot to Groucho as well, when he realized that I was into the same stuff he was into. I remember one day I hear, Steve, and it was always strange to hear my name come out of his mouth. And I went down the hall into his room. He had a $20 bill. He said, go down to Tower Records and get me some records. You know what I like. Thought, oh, that's so cool that he doesn't have to explain it. And I came back and I gave him change, and he couldn't believe that I actually had change back, because I shrewdly shopped.
We could talk forever, and I'm not letting you go yet, but thank God you have written this book. Show it again, and we're going to show it in more detail in the
Raised Eyebrows, my years inside Groucho's house, which, as we speak, is being developed into a motion picture.
Ooh.
We have a script. We have a director. We're beginning casting, which I can't talk about.
Oh.
But what's it's going to be like quintuply gratifying for me, because it's not a biography of Groucho any more than Ed Wood was a biography of Bela Lugosi. It's about Groucho in his twilight years, this kid, the starstruck kid being pulled into his circle,
wow.
And then this volatile, ambitious woman and what she brings to the thing. But it's going to be really weird seeing someone play me at 20 with my mutton chops,
wow.
And full head of hair.
Fascinating.
But yeah, it's going to be, a small quality film. It's not any kind of overview of his life or my life. It's just those astonishing 3 years I worked for him in the 70s, and basically the interactions of the household and Aaron and Groucho and young Steve.
So people, obviously, you have so much information. This book is going to be fantastic. So to leave us now, yes, I'd like to ask you, what did you learn about show business from him and some of his guests? What did you, that's why, or that's how that happens, or that's why that happened like that. What did you learn from Groucho?
What I learned from Groucho was there's nothing wrong with crediting someone for something funny instead of stealing it for yourself, which I thought was really classy, because too often you hear a comedian will hear a joke and then it appears in his act as if by magic, mysteriously that night, in front of a brick wall, not unlike the one they're going to shoot you at when we finish. But he would say, Robert Benchley had a very funny line. Or, Woody Allen had a funny line. He said, I don't mind dying. I just don't want to be there when it happens. That's a brilliant line. And that way, Groucho got the laugh and the appreciation, but he didn't mind handing it off. And I've done that since then. If someone says something funny, I'll say, my friend so-and-so said this. I can't take credit for this. But I get the laugh. As a matter of fact, I was on a Dick Cavett show alongside Pat McCormick, Larry Gelbart,
Oh
and
my
David
God, I
Lloyd.
know Pat. I know Pat.
And I was brought out sort of just representing the young beginning writer, because I had come back to LA after writing for Cavett in New York. This is a whole other subject. But people were sharing Pat McCormick stories, which everyone seemed to have, and which many of them couldn't be said on television. And I thought, I'm going to go for it. And I said, I have a Pat McCormick story, and I have only just now met Mr. McCormick. And they looked puzzled. And I said, this was told to me by a friend, a writer friend named E. Jack Kaplan. And Pat nodded knowingly. And I said, Jack told me that he and Pat were driving past the Braille Institute on Cahuenga one night. And I see the other people go, well, I'm starting to tell this, because they thought, oh, Jesus, the Braille Institute. And Pat noticed that all the lights were out in the building, and he said, oh, they must be working late tonight. That got a thunderclap of laughter from the panel, which was so gratifying, because I told it right, but I said, this is the man that said that brilliant line. And as we were dissolving into the commercial break, you could hear David Lloyd, the creative force. He wrote Chuckles Bites the Dust for Mary Tyler Moore and Frasier. You hear him say, must be working late tonight. That's wonderful. So I learned that you don't need to hog the spotlight. Also, ego-wise, I was much more drawn to Groucho's friends who had become legends and were comfortable with it and were very down to earth. Aaron had befriended more of the new hot younger stars, and I found that they were the ones that had the attitude, but not George Burns, not Steve Allen, not Jack Lemmon. And I realized it was Groucho's 84th birthday, and at which they astonishingly had a separate cake for me, because my birthday was 10 days earlier, which blew me, or 3 days earlier, which blew me away. Jack Lemmon was there. Harpo's son, Bill, was there. And I overheard Bill say to Jack Lemmon, there's so many jerks in this business, but you are a genuinely nice guy. And Lemmon said, oh, well, thanks, but, there's no reason not to be. And at the time, I remember thinking that that was just sort of a pleasant answer, but that has stayed with me over the years. There is no reason not to be a nice guy unless you're wrong. And that's what I try to do, is I trust someone until they betray me. And I have friends who don't trust someone till they earn it. So it's the half a glass of water thing.
And there is one more story that we talked about right before the show that we have not gotten to, which is unbelievable. Well,
you said that you are 80s golden age of comedy, and it was only on a technicality that since Groucho was in his 80s, I was able to get on your show for the 80s golden age. But when I moved to New York in 82, which constitutes the 80s, I went to work at HBO writing for Dick Cavett. And I was also sort of HBO's in-house writer for other miscellaneous shows. I wrote the continuity for 2 of the Young Comedian shows.
Wow.
One of them was, the host was Alan King. The other was John Candy, who I really liked a lot. And Bill Maher was on one of the shows.
Wow.
Paula Poundstone. So the producer of the show said to me, Steve, you were out there in LA. Were there any comedians there that maybe we haven't heard of that you think might work for the show? And I had dabbled in improv and had gotten to know a certain fellow. And I said, well, yes, there is. There's someone who I found hysterical who could make me laugh until I worried that my lungs wouldn't reinflate before I keeled over. But I think he's a little too much. And she, I won't mention her name, Sue Solomon, she said to me, Steve, this is HBO. We can do things the networks can't do. I think this is, and I want to, what is his name? I said, Sam Kinison. And she said, that's the same answer that other guy, Jim Carrey, gave us when we asked him about it.
They all knew each other. They all knew each other.
And she said, can you get a hold of him? And I said, I think so. I had his phone number. So I called and woke him up. That you had two choices. You either got voicemail or you woke him up. That was the menu. And I said, Sam, it's Steve Stoliar. Oh, yeah, Steve, how are you? I said, listen, we're talking about putting together a young comedian show. And I was telling them about it. And they wanted to see, do you have like a scratch tape? No, I don't have anything. I guess I could set up a camera or something at the Comedy Store tonight. Do you think that'd be good enough? And I said, I'm sure. You know, the quality's not going to be good. This would be great, Steve. And I said, well, I can't promise anything, but and I gave him my address, and he said, okay, hey, thanks a lot. So he sends me this half-inch videotape. It's just from a camera sitting there recording him pacing back and forth. We go into Sue's office and close the door with the other people working behind the scenes. And we start watching this thing and we're just wetting our pants over it.
Jeez.
And at the end of it, Sue said, we can't put that on.
Oh.
And I thought, what happened to, this is HBO. Da, 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 da. 2 years later, Rodney Dangerfield was going to be producing the show himself for HBO. And he had complete control over who was on. He put Sam Kinison on and his career skyrocketed after that. But it would have been because I interceded and woke him up to send a scratch tape.
Very nice.
Anyway, there's my 80s golden age of comedy anecdote. And Sam was a great guy that was gentle and bright and nice and not at all the screaming four-letter words anti-woman guy that he was on stage. He was bright and thoughtful and just a sweet guy who left us too soon.
Yeah, I had a chance to see him several times at the Comedy Store, and it was, it was memorable. It's you don't forget who was that? Oh yeah, okay, I'll never forget him again.
No, because they told me he was the guy that would come in when everybody else was done and no one could follow him. Because I was working briefly in improv at this place called $2 Bills on Franklin in Hollywood. And basically right before they put the curved wood chairs up on the tables, he would come in after having done sets at other clubs and pace back and forth. And it wasn't that he was outrageous. It was the brilliance of it, just doing a whole thing about what does an elephant think when he's trained in the circus? Oh, you want me to lift up that foot? Okay, I don't know why you think this is entertaining. All right, now I'll lift this. He just came at things from an angle that just got to me. So,
wow, great story.
I should probably say, just for the heck of it, that Raised Eyebrows is available on Amazon in Kindle and audiobook with me doing the voices, big surprise. But if someone would like to get a copy of the actual book and have me sign it or inscribe it to them or say happy anniversary to Sid and Ethel, you can order it off my website, which is Steve Stoliar, STOLIAR.com. And I'll be happy to sign and send it your way. Yes, a question from the man in the back. Oh, you want a book? Well, hey, what are you doing, man? He's writing a book. Okay. That's
hey, good Steve, this was great.
Oh, thanks, Bruce. I enjoyed it.
And thank Stephen Joyner for putting us together. You just never know how things are going to work out. And this was fantastic. You're great.
Thank you.
It's just, and to know that you went on from that to working with Cavett, and Cavett opened up this door and that door and HBO. That's the part.
Woody Allen. And I've got.
Maybe we'll do another show sometime, and you can catch up on that.
Did you know Mike Rowe in your stand-up days?
No.
In New York? No. Okay.
I was an LA guy.
Oh, all right.
I was specifically an improv LA guy in the 80s, and I hardly know anything else about anything else. But thank you so much for spending time with us. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
I hope that we get a lot of eyeballs on those books eventually.
Not the most important thing in the world. As Steve Allen liked to say, if I've made even one person laugh, then it was a lousy night.
I'll tell you a Steve Allen story real quickly. I believe I was the last person to ever interview Steve Allen.
Wow.
He had an office on Burbank Boulevard, very near whatever it is, in the highway right there. And I lived literally 2 doors down from him. And I was writing for a local paper, a local magazine. And he gave me an interview, and he died like a month or 2 later.
Oh, man. Yeah, he
was a great guy. Great guy. Wonderful experience, just so real. And boy,
I have great letters from him that have stuff like, I hope this sets the record straight, which is more than my Pioneer turntable can do. Or be that as it may, and I doubt that it is.
And he's such a straight-looking guy.
Yes.
And he started comedy, with the Tonight Show, 60 years ago, whatever it was.
Great.
Unbelievable. So thanks again.
My pleasure, Bruce.
Let's stay in contact,
I'll see you in cyberspace. Let me know when this is snipped together.
I sure will. God bless. Thank you, everybody, for watching the 80s Golden Age of Comedy. Steve Stoliar. It keeps getting better and better and better. Thank you, sir. Bye-bye, everybody.